I had just spent 2 grueling weeks on a commercial construction site in the blistering heat of Texas. As a senior structural engineer, my days were consumed by delayed supply chains, incompetent subcontractors, and a heat wave that felt like it was actively trying to melt the massive steel beams into useless puddles on the concrete foundation. The physical toll of the job was heavy, but the mental exhaustion was what really drained me. All I wanted in the entire world was a long, scalding hot shower, a heavy pour of aged bourbon, and the absolute, unbroken silence of my own private sanctuary. I dragged my heavy canvas duffel bag down the dim, familiar industrial hallway of my residential building. The comforting scent of century-old exposed brick and freshly roasted coffee from the ground floor cafe drifted up the stairwell, acting like a chemical signal to my exhausted brain that I was finally off the clock. The stress in my shoulders began to unspool. I stopped in front of my apartment door. It was a heavy, solid core steel door that I had personally sanded down and painted a flawless matte black. It was my absolute pride and joy. I reached out with my right hand and tapped the sleek glass surface of the enterprise-grade smart lock keypad mounted on the wall. The digital numbers illuminated instantly in a crisp, sharp white glow against the shadows of the corridor. I punched in my secure 6-digit access code, a sequence I had memorized perfectly. The lock clicked, but it did not disengage. Instead, the keypad blinked a harsh, rapid red. A soft, automated robotic voice chimed clearly in the quiet hallway. Access denied. I paused, blinking hard, trying to shake away the travel fatigue clouding my vision. I figured that maybe I had just hit the wrong key. My fingers were stiff and calloused from the long flight and weeks of handling rough building materials. I took a slow, deep breath, rolled my tight shoulders back, and carefully entered the 6-digit code a second time. I moved my finger deliberately, making absolutely sure that each individual press registered perfectly on the glass surface. The red light flashed again. Access denied. Master code overridden. The automated words did not process in my brain immediately. Master code overridden. I stood perfectly still. As a structural engineer and a specialist in commercial building automation, I do not believe in magic, and I certainly do not believe in ghosts in the machine. Digital security systems do exactly what they are programmed to do by human hands. They do not have bad days. They do not make spontaneous decisions. If the master administrative code of my personal network was overridden, it meant only one possible thing. A physical human being, someone possessing the physical backup emergency key, had manually bypassed the digital security protocols from the inside of the apartment. I stood alone in the quiet, empty hallway, staring blankly at the glowing red digital panel. I did not raise my fist and pound on the heavy steel door. I did not shout demands to whoever was inside. My hands did not shake with panic. Instead of a fiery, explosive rage, a cold, heavy, and incredibly sharp clarity settled deep into the pit of my stomach. My analytical brain seamlessly took over, completely shutting down my emotional responses. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy work jacket, pulled out my cell phone, and scrolled through my contacts until I found my mother, Patricia. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. She picked up on the very second ring. Her voice came through the speaker bright, breezy, and entirely too cheerful for a Thursday evening. "Caleb, honey," she chirped happily, clearly utilizing a practiced, artificial warmth. "I am so incredibly glad you finally called. I was meaning to reach out to you earlier this week, but things have just been completely out of control and hectic around here." I kept my breathing perfectly steady and my voice entirely level. "Mom," I said quietly, "why is the master administrative code on my apartment door currently overwritten?" There was a sudden, distinct pause on the other end of the line. It was not a pause of confusion. It was the specific, calculated kind of silence people deploy when they are bracing for a massive impact they know is coming, but are still desperately hoping they might somehow dodge. "Well," she started, her tone instantly shifting into a placating, overly sweet register. It was the exact tone she always used when she was trying to smooth over a massive, catastrophic disaster that she had a hand in creating. That is actually exactly what I wanted to talk to you about tonight. We had to move Michael into the loft. I stood perfectly still in the hallway, my eyes locked on the black steel door. Michael, my 25-year-old younger brother. What are you talking about? I asked, letting the words clip off sharp and hard like pieces of shattered glass. Oh, Caleb, please try to have just a little bit of compassion. She sighed loudly, instantly aggressively playing the emotional guilt card she kept hidden up her sleeve. You know that his divorce was officially finalized last week. Audrey completely kicked him out of their house. He has absolutely nowhere else to go. He is entirely devastated. Honey, his whole life is falling apart at the seams. Your father and I simply could not just let our youngest boy sleep in his car or at some dangerous, cheap roadside motel. So, you decided to let him into my private home? I asked slowly, while I was thousands of miles out of state working. You are a single man, Caleb, she reasoned, her voice actively gaining confidence now that her dark secret was finally out in the open air. You are 28 years old. You make incredibly good money as an engineer. You can easily afford to stay at a nice downtown hotel for a little while, or even just rent another temporary apartment. Michael desperately needs stability right now. He needs the comfort of a nice, high-end home to get his head straight and heal his broken heart. You owe your little brother this much. Just take the hit for the family, okay? Please just be the bigger person for once. She just kept talking. She started rambling endlessly about family unity, unconditional love, and forgiveness. But I had completely stopped listening to the actual words she was saying. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her reasoning echoed violently in the quiet hallway. They did not call me to ask for a favor. They did not request permission. They simply broke into my life and took what they wanted, because they felt entirely entitled to the fruits of my grueling labor. I did not hang up the phone immediately. I just stood there in the cold corridor and let her talk, listening intently to the sound of my own mother aggressively justifying a literal home invasion. Finally, when she paused to take a dramatic breath, I spoke. I will handle it, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. Oh, thank you so much, Caleb. I knew you would understand if I just explained it. You are always the reliable one. We will have you over for a nice dinner on Sunday to celebrate. I ended the call without another word. The total silence of the hallway crashed back down around me, heavier than before. I dropped my heavy canvas duffel bag onto the solid concrete floor with a loud thud. I unzipped the reinforced front compartment and pulled out my rugged, military-grade contractor laptop. I did not go looking for a coffee shop. I sat down cross-legged right there on the dusty hallway floor, flipped the thick screen open, and booted the machine up. I am a structural engineer, but I specialize in modern, high-tech commercial infrastructure. When I personally gutted and rebuilt this loft over the course of a year, I did not just wire it for standard electricity and basic internet. I wired the entire space for absolute, unbreakable digital control. The smart home ecosystem running behind those brick walls was enterprise-grade, the exact kind of complex setup you usually only see in high-end, heavily guarded commercial properties. I opened the secure cloud administration portal on my screen. Because I built the network architecture from scratch, it took me less than 30 seconds to bypass the localized lockout and access the master security logs. I read the raw data streaming rapidly across the glowing screen in front of me. 4 days ago, at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, someone used the physical emergency backup key to open the front door. It was the single, solitary key that I had foolishly left sealed inside a tamper-proof envelope in my father's heavy iron safe, meant strictly for absolute life-or-death medical emergencies. 10 minutes after that physical entry, the system registered a manual hard reset on the interior control panel. They had successfully wiped my biometric fingerprint data and my numerical hex code from the localized drive, replacing it entirely with a new one. They honestly thought they had locked me out of my own home. They were completely ignorant to the fact that a localized physical override does not ever sever the master cloud administration rights if you possess the backdoor developer protocols. I did not get up from the floor. I did not aggressively bang my fists on the heavy steel door. I did not scream my brother's name into the hallway. I simply let my calloused fingers fly rapidly across the illuminated keyboard. First, I accessed the central network router. I initiated a deep scan of every single device currently drawing a signal within the apartment. I found his smartphone, his massive gaming console, and his personal laptop. With 3 deliberate keystrokes, I permanently blacklisted every single MAC address currently connected to the local area network. Goodbye, high-speed fiber optic internet. Second, I accessed the central climate control matrix. It was late November, and it was a crisp 45 degrees outside with a biting wind coming off the harbor. I overrode the interior digital thermostat. I did not just turn the temperature down. I completely shut down the primary heating matrix, severing the digital communication between the thermostat and the furnace. Third, I accessed the smart breaker panel I had installed in the utility closet. I systematically and ruthlessly killed the power grid to the living room entertainment center, the luxury kitchen appliances, the massive hot water heater, and every single power outlet located in the primary living space. The only electrical circuit I intentionally left active was a single, incredibly harsh, bright fluorescent overhead light in the master bathroom. Finally, I initiated a total system lockdown. I encrypted the local permissions with a randomized 24-character password. Absolutely no one inside that apartment could manually change the temperature, turn on a television, boil a pot of water, or take a warm shower without my direct, digital authorization. I closed the heavy laptop with a satisfying click, slid it carefully back into my canvas bag, and stood up from the cold floor. I calmly adjusted the collar of my work jacket, picked up my heavy luggage, and turned my back entirely on my own front door. I walked out of the residential building, stepping out into the freezing, dark evening air. The local police precinct was exactly 6 blocks away down the avenue. I did not run. I walked at a perfectly steady, highly measured pace. The intense anger building inside of my chest was not hot, chaotic, or explosive. It was freezing cold. It was the exact kind of calculated anger that builds massive concrete structures, calculates the exact stress limit of load-bearing walls, and prepares to tear them down with absolute, devastating precision. To truly comprehend how my parents reached a point where legally stealing a home seemed like a perfectly reasonable and justifiable course of action, you have to understand the deeply toxic psychological dynamic of the household I grew up in. I am 3 full years older than Michael, but from the exact moment my mother brought him home from the hospital, the entire universe was aggressively reconstructed to revolve entirely around his needs. In modern family psychology, there is a very specific clinical term for it. It is called the golden child syndrome, and consequently, it turns the other sibling into the designated scapegoat. Michael was naturally charismatic, incredibly loud, and constantly demanded to be the center of attention in any room he walked into. I, on the other hand, was quiet, highly observant, and intensely preferred taking complex mechanical things apart in the garage just to see how the gears worked. My parents made their profound favoritism painfully clear, not through grand, cinematic declarations of love, but through 1,000 tiny, agonizing daily choices that slowly built the foundation of our miserable family dynamic. When we were kids, the rules of reality seemed to bend completely whenever Michael was involved. If Michael recklessly threw a baseball inside the house and shattered an expensive living room window, my mother would immediately rush over to make sure he was not frightened by the loud noise. It was always written off as a simple accident. Boys will be boys, my father would laugh, sweeping up the glass. But if I accidentally left a single wrench on the garage workbench instead of hanging it on the pegboard, I was forced to stand there and endure a blistering 30-minute lecture about responsibility, maturity, and having deep respect for other people's property. By the time I turned 14 years old, I realized that if I wanted anything in life, I was going to have to bleed for it myself. I started mowing lawns, shoveling heavy snow in the winter, and doing manual labor for neighbors just to buy my own decent school clothes and save up for a used, beat-up pickup truck. I paid for my own gas. I paid my own insurance. When Michael graduated from high school with absolutely mediocre grades, my parents secretly drained a massive portion of their savings to buy him a brand new, imported sports car with 0 miles on the odometer. When I asked them why, my mother looked at me with genuine confusion and said they simply did not want him feeling inferior to his wealthier friends at college. The cardinal rule of the household was unspoken, but it was absolute, and it was enforced with military strictness. Caleb handles his own problems silently. The entire family drops everything to handle Michael's problems loudly. I was never a son to them. I was simply an autonomous utility, a piece of reliable background machinery that was entirely ignored until something broke and needed to be fixed for free. Michael's greatest, most celebrated achievement in his entire 25 years of existence was successfully marrying his ex-wife, Audrey. Audrey was incredibly smart, strikingly beautiful, and most importantly to my parents, she came from a family possessing serious, intimidating generational wealth. Her father owned and operated a massive, highly lucrative chain of luxury car dealerships across the state. When Michael and Audrey got married 3 years ago, my parents acted like their youngest son had personally cured a terrible disease and won the Nobel Peace Prize. They shamelessly bragged to absolutely everyone who would tolerate listening about their boy's massive, sprawling custom house in the gated suburbs. They flaunted the expensive country club memberships Audrey paid for, and posted endless pictures of the luxury vacations they took on her family's private dime. But Michael had never actually learned how to build a single thing in his life, let alone something as complex and fragile as a real marriage. Because of how my parents had raised him, he honestly believed that a wealthy wife was just another substitute parent. He viewed Audrey as someone who was legally obligated to provide a lavish lifestyle for him, while he did absolutely whatever he pleased without any consequences. He recklessly spent her money on designer clothes and expensive watches. He flatly refused to hold down a steady, respectable job, claiming that entry-level work was beneath his potential. And eventually, inevitably, because he possessed zero impulse control, he started sleeping around with women he met at upscale downtown bars. But Audrey was not Patricia. Audrey was not our enabling mother who would endlessly clean up his messes. Audrey was a ruthless, highly educated businesswoman who possessed a titanium-clad prenuptial agreement drafted by a team of terrifying corporate lawyers. When she found out about his infidelity 3 weeks ago, she did not cry. She did not scream. She simply packed all of his expensive, designer clothes into heavy black plastic garbage bags, left them piled unceremoniously on the edge of the long driveway, changed every single lock on her massive estate, and handed him a thick stack of finalized divorce papers through the cracked window of a hired security guard's vehicle. When Michael fell from grace, he fell incredibly hard. He hit the concrete reality of life at terminal velocity. And true to their lifelong, toxic form, my parents immediately scrambled in a blind panic to try and catch him. They threw themselves into an absolute frenzy, desperately trying to cushion the devastating blow for their perfect, flawless boy. But there was a massive logistical problem. My parents had long ago downsized. They lived in a very small, cramped 2-bedroom retirement condo on the outskirts of the city. They simply did not have the physical space, nor the endless luxury amenities that Michael had grown so deeply accustomed to during his marriage to Audrey. And that is exactly when their greedy eyes slowly turned toward me. They looked at the reliable one, the one who had never once asked them for a single dime, the one who had just spent the last year bleeding to build something incredibly beautiful and highly valuable. They looked at my hard-earned stability and coldly decided that my life was the perfect, acceptable sacrifice to lay at Michael's feet to make him stop crying. They honestly and truly believed that simply because we shared the exact same genetic sequence, my personal achievements and my physical property were nothing more than communal family assets, just waiting to be casually redistributed whenever the golden child inevitably stubbed his toe. They did not understand what that specific apartment meant to me. They arrogantly thought it was just 4 walls, a roof, and a place to sleep between shifts. They had absolutely no concept of the blood, the sweat, the financial terror, and the sheer, brutal force of human will it took to bring that specific space to life. 2 years ago, I found the raw space. It was a massive, derelict storage loft located directly above a failing, bankrupt printing press in the industrial district. The high ceiling leaked rainwater in 6 different places. The ancient electrical wiring was a catastrophic fire hazard just waiting for a spark. And the original concrete floor was entirely covered in decades of thick, black industrial grease and grime. Absolutely nobody on the real estate market wanted to touch it. But as a structural engineer, I am trained to ignore the superficial garbage. I look for the bones. I saw the gorgeous, century-old exposed brick completely hidden under layers of cheap, rotting drywall. I saw the massive, load-bearing steel I-beams traversing the ceiling. I negotiated and signed a 10-year, ironclad commercial lease with the desperate building owner, inserting a highly specific legal clause that allowed me to completely gut and renovate the interior space at my own expense, in exchange for a permanently locked-in, incredibly low monthly rent. For 6 brutal months, I effectively worked 2 full-time jobs. My exhausting day job managing massive commercial construction sites, and my grueling night job rebuilding my own personal home from the studs up. I personally tore down the rotted, moldy drywall with a heavy sledgehammer until my hands literally bled through my thick leatherwork gloves. I rented a heavy-duty, commercial wet grinder and spent 3 agonizing weekends on my hands and knees, grinding the old, stained concrete floor all the way down to the raw aggregate base. Then, I painstakingly poured and leveled a flawless, mirror-like epoxy resin finish across the entire expanse. I completely rewired the entire electrical grid of the loft myself, pulling miles of heavy copper wire through old steel conduits to ensure the system could handle my high-tech servers. I designed and built a custom architectural kitchen, hand-pouring a massive, solid glass fiber reinforced concrete countertop that was so incredibly heavy it required 4 grown men and a mechanical winch just to lift it into place. I installed specialized smart glass panels in the master bathroom, automated blackout shades on the massive industrial windows, and an encrypted security system that could legitimately rival a bank vault. It was not just an apartment to me. It was my physical resume. It was the undeniable, physical manifestation of my sheer competence and my independence. It was my private sanctuary, built exactly to my rigid specifications, designed to keep the chaotic, noisy world completely locked outside. As I continued my cold, methodical walk down the freezing city blocks toward the police station, I vividly remembered the single solitary time my brother Michael had ever actually come to visit my home. It was exactly 1 month after I had officially moved my furniture into the finished loft. He walked through my heavy steel front door wearing a pair of ridiculous, imported designer loafers that he had undoubtedly purchased using his wealthy wife's limitless credit card. He stood in the entryway and looked around the massive, open-concept industrial space. He looked up at the carefully exposed metal ductwork, stared at the raw brick walls, and visibly wrinkled his nose in profound disgust. "You actually live here by choice?" he had asked, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed loudly in the open space. "This place looks like an abandoned sweatshop, Caleb. Audrey and I have a guest pool house that is significantly bigger and nicer than this dirty garage. Why do you always have to be so aggressively blue-collar and depressing?" He had stood in the very center of my home, looked directly at the physical culmination of the hardest, most punishing labor of my entire life, and casually called it garbage. And now, a year later, simply because he had entirely ruined his own privileged life through his own incredible stupidity, he honestly thought he could just slide seamlessly into the exact same home he had deeply insulted. He thought he could just change the electronic locks like a cowardly thief in the night and claim the fruits of my grueling labor as his own personal rehabilitation center. Standing outside the glass doors of the police precinct, watching the blue and red lights of the patrol cars illuminating the cold concrete sidewalk, something deep inside my chest finally, permanently snapped. It did not happen with a loud, dramatic noise. It happened with the quiet, incredibly heavy, permanent click of a massive steel lock tumbling perfectly into place. The absolute final, fraying thread of biological obligation I ever felt toward my parents or my brother severed entirely. The obedient, quiet, good son who always kept the peace, who always stepped aside into the shadows to let the golden child shine, was completely dead. In his place stood a licensed commercial contractor who had just discovered unauthorized, hostile personnel trespassing on his active job site. And I was about to clear the site with extreme prejudice. If you are listening to this right now and you understand exactly what it feels like to finally cut the cord on toxic family members, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to, and leave a comment down below with the name of the city you are living in. Every single comment helps push this story out to more people who need to hear it. Thank you so much for the support. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the precinct. The interior smelled exactly like stale, burnt coffee, cheap floor wax, and deeply tired people. I walked purposefully up to the high wooden front desk, ready to initiate the total destruction of my brother's incredibly fragile reality. The desk sergeant at the police precinct looked up from his computer monitor, eyeing my dust-covered steel-toe boots and my heavy canvas work jacket. He asked how he could help me, his voice carrying the distinct, exhausted drawl of a man who dealt with the worst elements of the city on a nightly basis. I did not launch into an emotional, frantic story about family betrayal. I simply set my heavy bag down on the scuffed counter, unzipped the reinforced side pocket, and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized manila folder. In the commercial construction business, you learn very quickly to always travel with hard, physical copies of your most vital documents. Cloud servers can fail, but paper on a desk demands immediate attention. I need to formally report a breaking and entering and an illegal, unauthorized occupation of my private residential property, I stated, keeping my voice perfectly steady and utterly devoid of panic. The officer sighed heavily, reaching for a yellow legal notepad and a pen. He asked if the suspect was a domestic partner or a complete stranger. "He is my younger brother," I replied plainly. "He utilized a stolen emergency backup key to access my private home while I was thousands of miles out of state on a job site. He maliciously altered the electronic security locks to deny me legal entry, and he has currently taken up unauthorized residence inside my loft. I have the original notarized property lease in my name. I have the municipal utility bills in my name. I have my state-issued identification. And most importantly, I have the time-stamped digital security logs proving exactly when the unauthorized entry and the digital override occurred." I slid the heavy folder directly across the counter. There was no ambiguity. It was a textbook, undeniable case of an illegal eviction. Exactly 30 minutes later, I was walking right back down the familiar, dimly lit brick hallway of my building. But this time, I was closely flanked by two fully uniformed police officers. The heavy, synchronized tread of our boots echoed loudly against the walls. Officer Mark, a broad-shouldered, seasoned veteran with a completely no-nonsense demeanor, stepped directly up to my black steel door and knocked loudly, his knuckles hitting the heavy metal with authority. "Police," he announced firmly. "Open the door." There was a long, tense silence, followed closely by the distinct, frantic sound of fumbling from the other side. The heavy door slowly swung open, and there stood my younger brother, Michael. The visual alone was absolutely enough to make my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. He was casually wearing my dark gray, heavy cotton bathrobe. In his right hand, he held one of my expensive crystal tumbler glasses, filled to the brim with an amber liquid that I instantly recognized as my 18-year-old aged Macallan Scotch. He looked confused for a fraction of a second, then intensely irritated, and finally, a flash of genuine, unadulterated panic widened his eyes when he saw me standing completely silent right behind the officers. "What is going on here?" Michael asked, his voice cracking slightly, attempting to sound authoritative but failing miserably. "Sir, are you the legal, documented resident of this specific apartment?" Officer Mark asked, his right hand resting casually but deliberately on his heavy leather duty belt. Michael immediately shifted gears, seamlessly slipping into the exact role he had played for his entire 25 years of life. The helpless, persecuted victim. He puffed out his chest, completely ignoring the fact that the apartment was freezing cold because I had cut the heat, and put on a pathetic look of wounded innocence. "Yes, well, it is a family home," he stammered defensively. My older brother let me stay here because I am currently going through a really terrible, traumatic divorce. I am just trying to get back on my feet, and he is clearly having some sort of severe mental breakdown. He actually tried to utilize the Darvo tactic directly on the police. Deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. It was almost impressive how incredibly naturally the toxic lie rolled off his tongue. I did not raise my voice to argue with him. I simply stepped forward, holding my manila folder. Officer, I have never, at any point, given this man verbal or written permission to enter my home, I stated clearly. I have been out of state working for 2 full weeks. He used a stolen physical key, and he altered the electronic locks. I have already provided you with the digital logs and the binding lease agreement. Michael's face flushed a deep, ugly red. Caleb, what the hell are you actually doing? He whined loudly. Mom said it was perfectly fine for me to be here. You cannot just throw your own flesh and blood out onto the freezing street. We are family. Sir, Officer Mark interrupted, his tone instantly hardening like setting concrete. The legal lease is solely in Caleb's name. You have absolutely no legal standing here whatsoever. Changing the locks on a property you do not personally own constitutes a felony illegal eviction. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever personal belongings you brought with you and vacate these premises immediately, or you will be leaving this building in heavy steel handcuffs for trespassing and breaking and entering. But I live here now, Michael whined, his sophisticated facade entirely crumbling into that of a petulant, oversized toddler. Mom gave me the key. She said it was mine until I got back on my feet. Then you can gladly take that specific issue up with your mother, the second officer said, stepping aggressively into the doorway and gesturing toward the interior. 10 minutes. Let us move. Michael glared at me, pure, concentrated hatred radiating from his eyes. He slammed my heavy crystal glass down onto the concrete counter, aggressively spilling the expensive scotch everywhere, and stormed past the officers into the bedroom to frantically pack his bags. Exactly 9 minutes later, he emerged dragging 2 massive, oversized designer suitcases. He was out of breath and his face was twisted in rage. You are an absolute monster, Caleb, he spat venomously, stopping right in front of me. Mom and Dad are never, ever going to forgive you for this. You are entirely dead to this family. I looked at him, completely and utterly unbothered by his pathetic threats. Drop the robe, Michael, I said, my voice deadpan. He blinked in shock. What? This is my bathrobe. No, it is not, I corrected him coldly. Take it off. Right now. He stared at me, deeply humiliated, as the 2 police officers watched silently, their hands resting on their belts. With shaking, angry hands, he stripped off the heavy cotton robe, leaving him standing in the freezing hallway in nothing but a wrinkled t-shirt and thin sweatpants. He threw the robe onto the dusty floor at my feet, violently grabbed his heavy suitcases, and marched toward the elevator, muttering endless strings of curses under his breath. The officer stayed long enough to ensure he exited the building entirely, handed me an official incident report number, and left me alone. I locked the heavy steel door behind them, securely engaging the deadbolt, and finally stood entirely alone in my own home. But the initial victory was incredibly short-lived. I pulled out my phone, utilized my master administrative override to turn the main breaker back on, and illuminated the massive loft. I needed to actually look at what he had done. The structural engineer inside of me fully took over the driver's seat. It was time to systematically assess the damage. I walked slowly through the quiet space, my heavy work boots making absolutely no sound. The rushing adrenaline that had been pumping frantically through my veins during the police confrontation was completely fading away now. It was entirely replaced by the hyper-focused, incredibly cold, and deeply analytical state of mind I always enter when I am assessing a compromised, dangerous commercial job site. I did not feel like a sad victim whose private sanctuary had been cruelly violated. I felt exactly like a forensic auditor stepping into a massive disaster zone, fully prepared to calculate the exact, staggering financial cost of someone else's catastrophic negligence. I walked straight into my home office, inputted the code to my heavy fireproof wall safe, and pulled out my professional digital single-lens reflex camera. I took the extra time to carefully attach a high-powered external flash unit. Then, I grabbed my thick, leather-bound contractor logbook, a couple of heavy-duty graphite pencils, and a bright yellow steel tape measure. It was time to go to work, and I was going to be meticulously thorough about every single millimeter of this place. Michael had only been inside my private home for 4 days. That is exactly 96 hours. But a grown man who has never once in his life respected the value of hard physical labor, a man who has always had his disgusting messes magically cleaned up by a wealthy wife or deeply enabling parents, can cause an astonishing, almost breathtaking amount of destruction in 96 hours. I logically started my assessment in the kitchen. My absolute pride and joy in this entire architectural loft was the massive center island. I had poured it myself from a highly customized mix of high-strength glass fiber reinforced concrete. I had spent countless agonizing hours polishing it by hand with diamond grip abrasive pads until it was as smooth and reflective as black glass. And then I had sealed it with a premium, commercial-grade epoxy resin to make it entirely invincible to normal wear and tear. I walked directly over to the exact spot where Michael had violently slammed down my crystal glass just minutes prior. He had not just spilled expensive aged scotch. Looking closely under the harsh white light, I realized he had been slicing fresh, highly acidic lemons directly on the bare surface without using a wooden cutting board. The strong citric acid from the lemons had eaten entirely through the protective epoxy sealant layer, leaving deep, cloudy, white chemical etch marks burned right into the dark, porous concrete matrix. You cannot just take a wet kitchen sponge and wipe that kind of chemical damage away. Fixing it meant bringing in heavy industrial wet grinders, stripping the entire 12-foot surface down to the raw base layer, repolishing the concrete all over again from scratch, and applying a brand new coat of expensive resin over the entire massive island so it would cure perfectly evenly. The specialized labor alone would cost thousands of dollars. I snapped 4 high-resolution photos from several different angles, making absolutely sure the bright camera flash highlighted the deep chemical burns perfectly. Next was the flooring in the main living room. When I renovated, I had intentionally installed 3/4-inch thick, solid Brazilian walnut planks, floating over a premium sound-dampening subfloor. Brazilian walnut is an incredibly dense, heavy wood. It takes a massive amount of deliberate, concentrated force to actually damage it. I knelt down on the floor, running my bare hand slowly over the wood. There were deep, jagged, splintered gouges running a continuous length of 14 feet straight across the center of the room. Michael had dragged his incredibly heavy, oversized designer suitcases, which clearly had a broken, jagged metal wheel, straight across the bare, polished wood instead of simply picking them up and carrying them like a normal adult. The ugly scratches were way too incredibly deep to simply buff out with some cheap floor wax. Repairing this disaster meant I would have to carefully pull up the baseboards, aggressively rip out the damaged interlocking planks, install brand new custom planks, and then completely sand down and restain the entire living room floor from corner to corner to ensure the rich color and finish matched perfectly without any visible seams. I laid my bright yellow steel tape measure right beside the massive gouges for visual scale and took a dozen macro shots, thoroughly documenting the exact depth and length of the sheer destruction. Before I detail exactly how I executed my forensic audit on the rest of his destruction, let me know down in the comments, what is the exact moment you realized a toxic family member was completely beyond saving? The master bathroom was somehow even worse than the kitchen and the living room. I had previously installed a high-tech smart glass shower enclosure, the incredibly expensive kind that seamlessly transitions from crystal clear to completely frosted and opaque with the simple flick of a wall switch. But the complex electrical system was severely malfunctioning. Michael had somehow managed to completely shatter the waterproof digital control panel mounted on the subway tile wall, highly likely by throwing something incredibly heavy at it during one of his characteristic violent temper tantrums. The liquid crystal privacy layer suspended inside the thick glass panes was slowly bleeding out, creating a massive, ugly, dark digital blotch right in the very center of the heavy door. The entire custom glass panel would have to be entirely scrapped, custom-ordered from the original manufacturer, and carefully replaced by a highly specialized technician. I moved systematically from room to room. I rigorously documented the ugly black scorch marks on the outdoor balcony railing where he had been lazily putting out expensive cigars. I photographed a very noticeable, deep dent in the brushed stainless steel refrigerator door. I meticulously noted the missing bottles of high-end, imported liquor from my private cabinet, and the completely ruined, wine-stained Egyptian cotton bedsheets that had to be immediately thrown into the garbage. With every single click of the heavy camera shutter, the massive mental spreadsheet constantly running in my head updated itself. I was not pricing this horrific damage out like a forgiving, gentle older brother willing to overlook a few scratches for the sake of family peace. I was pricing this out exactly like a licensed, ruthless general contractor dealing with a rogue, highly destructive commercial tenant. I meticulously factored in the current retail cost of premium replacement materials, the standard 20% industry markup for expedited shipping, and the exorbitant hourly rate of master tradesmen required to execute the flawless repairs. Most importantly, I factored in my own professional hourly rate as the senior project manager overseeing the necessary reconstruction. When I finally finished my exhaustive sweep of the property, I sat down at my scarred kitchen table, opened my rugged laptop, and created a brand new, highly encrypted project file. I coldly named it Michael's Eviction. I uploaded the dozens of high-resolution images, attached the digital smart lock access logs, and began drafting a formal, incredibly detailed, itemized contractor estimate. When I finished the calculations, the final total came to exactly $25,000. I looked at that massive number glowing brightly on the screen and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, deeply satisfying clarity. He was going to pay for every single penny of it. By the time I woke up the very next morning, my cell phone was an absolute digital war zone. I checked the glowing screen and saw 47 missed calls and dozens upon dozens of frantic text messages. My mother, Patricia, had left 3 incredibly long voicemails, and her tone shifted wildly and aggressively in each one. The first voicemail was a bargaining, pleading tone, asking me to just calm down, act like an adult, and talk to them to sort this out. The second was full of furious, theatrical weeping, violently accusing me of throwing my own flesh and blood brother out onto the freezing, dangerous streets. The third was just pure, unadulterated rage. My father, Robert, had sent a massive wall of text detailing how I was single-handedly tearing our loving family apart. He bitterly complained that Michael was currently sleeping on their lumpy, uncomfortable living room sofa, that my mother had not stopped crying all night, and that he was profoundly disgusted by my utter lack of compassion and empathy. Even extended relatives, aunts, and distant cousins I had not spoken to in over 3 years were suddenly chiming in, blowing up my phone to blindly call me a ruthless, heartless monster who cared more about a stupid, pretentious apartment than actual human lives. I did not reply to a single one of them, not a single word. I immediately employed the gray rock method. It is a psychological tactic where you intentionally become as totally unresponsive and uninteresting as a plain gray rock, effectively starving manipulative and narcissistic people of the chaotic emotional drama they desperately crave to survive. I went straight into my phone settings, completely silenced all of their notifications, and routed every single one of their numbers directly to a silent voicemail box. The silence inside my apartment remained beautifully unbroken. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, I dialed the direct office line of my attorney, Arthur. Arthur was a sharp, aggressive, no-nonsense guy in his late 50s who specialized exclusively in complex commercial property disputes and high-stakes contract law. I securely emailed him the entire digital file I had compiled the night before. Arthur called me back exactly 20 minutes later. "Caleb, I just thoroughly reviewed the file," he said smoothly. "This is absolutely bulletproof. The illegal eviction alone gives us solid grounds for heavy statutory penalties in this state. The extensive property damage is just the final, heavy nail in the coffin. Do you want me to send a formal demand letter to scare him, or do we go straight to filing a civil suit?" "Skip the warning letter," I told him coldly. "File the massive suit immediately. Push for the maximum allowable damages under the law." And Arthur, under absolutely no circumstances do we offer or accept a settlement. I want a judge to completely rule on this. Understood completely, Arthur replied. But honestly, it would be a lot easier and significantly faster to crush his defense if we had solid, undeniable proof of a behavioral pattern. Something clearly showing he destroys property maliciously and on purpose when he does not get his way. That highly specific phrase from my attorney gave me a brilliant idea. During my lunch break, I sat in my truck and made a very specific, highly calculated phone call. 2 hours later, I was sitting comfortably in the shaded outdoor patio section of a high-end, ridiculously overpriced coffee shop located in the wealthy downtown district. A massive, sleek black luxury sport utility vehicle pulled smoothly up to the curb, and Audrey, Michael's wealthy ex-wife, stepped gracefully out. She looked absolutely immaculate. She was wearing a perfectly tailored designer blazer, oversized dark sunglasses, and she was glowing radiantly with the specific, undeniable energy of a woman who had just successfully dropped 180 pounds of dead, useless weight. She walked over confidently, sat down directly across from me, ordered an expensive iced espresso, and offered a polite, deeply knowing smile. "Caleb, I have to admit, I was genuinely surprised to get your phone call this morning," she said softly. "I just naturally assumed you were part of the great family blockade against me." "I am not a part of that toxic family anymore," I said plainly, looking her directly in the eye. I quickly, calmly, and methodically explained the entire absurd situation to her. The illegal break-in while I was out of state working, the horrific destruction of my custom concrete island, the deeply gouged Brazilian walnut floors, the police escort out of the building, and the massive $25,000 civil suit I had just officially authorized my lawyer to file with the city court. Audrey listened very quietly, elegantly sipping her iced coffee. When I finally finished detailing the exact financial estimate, she set her glass down gently on the marble table and let out a dry, entirely humorless laugh. "God, he is so incredibly predictable," she murmured, shaking her head in disbelief. "He throws a massive, violent temper tantrum, aggressively breaks expensive things he did not personally pay for, and just automatically expects someone else to swoop in and clean it up with their checkbook. He did the exact same thing to me, Caleb. That is actually the final, unforgivable reason I permanently threw him out of my house." She reached into her expensive, supple leather handbag, pulled out a sleek silver digital flash drive, and slid it directly across the cold marble table toward me. "I have a comprehensive, enterprise-grade smart home security system too, Caleb. Inside and outside the entire estate." The afternoon I legally handed him the official divorce papers, he completely lost his fragile mind. He grabbed a heavy metal golf club and went to town on my custom kitchen cabinets. And then he deliberately threw a heavy crystal vase straight through a priceless vintage stained glass window in the grand foyer. I had my private security team pull all the high-definition footage in case I needed to immediately file for an emergency restraining order. Everything is on that drive in crystal clear 4K resolution. I picked up the small metal device. It felt incredibly heavy with massive legal consequence. It was the exact, perfect missing puzzle piece my attorney Arthur had specifically asked for. It established a clear, undeniable, and legally binding pattern of malicious, intentional destruction of private property whenever Michael was angry. "Why exactly are you freely giving this highly sensitive evidence to me?" I asked, carefully putting the silver drive into my secure jacket pocket. Audrey gracefully adjusted her dark sunglasses. "Because for 3 long, miserable years, your enabling parents constantly made me feel like I was the crazy, demanding, entirely unreasonable wife for simply expecting their perfect golden son to act like a functional grown man. I want him to finally face the harsh, unforgiving reality he has been dodging for his entire life. Take him to the cleaners, Caleb. Ruin him." The formal civil court hearing was officially scheduled and finally took place exactly 6 agonizing weeks later. The city had fully transitioned into a bitter, freezing winter, which perfectly matched my current disposition. I arrived at the massive downtown municipal courthouse early, wearing a dark, perfectly tailored suit, feeling completely and utterly calm. There was no anxiety. There was no fear. I was stepping onto a battlefield where the only weapons allowed were verifiable facts and raw data, and I possessed an absolute armory of both. My attorney, Arthur, met me in the echoing, cavernous marble lobby of the courthouse. He was carrying a thick, heavy leather binder containing all of our printed legal exhibits and a secure, encrypted laptop. He gave me a firm, confident nod, and we walked silently together into the heavily wood-paneled courtroom, confidently taking our designated seats at the plaintiff's table. Exactly 10 minutes later, the heavy oak double doors at the very back of the quiet room creaked open, and my entire former family walked in together. It was a truly pathetic, almost comical sight to witness. Michael was wearing a cheap, deeply wrinkled gray suit that was clearly at least a full size too large for his frame. He had highly likely borrowed it from the back of my father's dusty closet. He looked exhausted, pale, and intensely nervous, his eyes darting frantically around the intimidating room like a trapped animal. My mother, Patricia, flanked him tightly on his right side. She was intentionally trying to look frail and broken, clutching a wadded-up white tissue tightly in her hands, clearly fully prepared to deploy her strategic, weaponized tears at a moment's notice to manipulate the judge. My father, Robert, walked slightly behind them, keeping his head down and absolutely refusing to make any eye contact with me whatsoever. He looked exactly like a man who deeply knew he was backing a losing horse but was entirely too cowardly to step off the track. They quietly took their seats at the defense table located directly across the center aisle. The presiding judge was a stern, incredibly sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s, who looked exactly like she had absolutely zero tolerance for emotional nonsense or courtroom theatrics. She loudly called the specific docket number and asked both the plaintiff and the defense for their formal opening statements. The trap I had spent 6 weeks meticulously building was officially sprung. Michael's defense attorney stood up first. He was a cheap, highly disorganized man whose suit looked just as rumpled and unconvincing as his legal arguments. He immediately attempted to frame the entire massive incident as a tragic, completely simple family misunderstanding that had unfortunately been blown entirely out of proportion. He loudly and dramatically claimed that my mother, Patricia, had given Michael direct verbal authority to access the apartment, and therefore Michael genuinely and truly believed he was an invited, legally welcome guest. He then brazenly argued that the extensive, catastrophic damages to my property were purely accidental, unfortunate byproducts of a highly stressful, deeply emotional moving process following a devastating divorce. Right on cue, as if she were an actor in a terrible daytime soap opera, my mother sniffled loudly from the hard wooden benches in the public gallery. She began dabbing her dry eyes aggressively with her tissue to maximize the theatrical, emotional effect, desperately trying to draw the sympathy of the stern judge. Arthur did not roll his eyes. He did not interrupt. He just let them dig a massive, inescapable hole with their own ridiculous lies. When the defense finally finished their pathetic opening statement, Arthur stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not raise his voice to match their emotional pitch. He did not engage with their ridiculous, manipulative family drama. He simply and methodically began to lay out the cold, incredibly hard data. First, Arthur formally presented the legally binding, notarized lease agreement, proving to the court my absolute, undisputed, and sole tenancy of the property. He established firmly that my mother possessed absolutely zero legal authority to grant anyone access to my private home. Then, he fired up his secure laptop and seamlessly projected the digital smart lock data logs directly onto the large, bright monitor mounted in the center of the courtroom. He walked the judge, step by meticulous step, through the exact, undeniable timestamp of the forced entry using the emergency physical key and the subsequent manual, deliberate override of the electronic security codes. "Your Honor," Arthur said smoothly, his commanding voice cutting sharply through the quiet room. "An invited, welcome guest does not manually wipe the biometric and electronic access codes of the primary resident in order to lock them out. This irrefutable digital evidence demonstrates clear, undeniable premeditation to illegally occupy the premises against my client's explicit will." The judge nodded slowly, her expression hardening significantly as she took diligent, rapid notes on her legal pad. She was clearly not buying the family misunderstanding narrative. Then came the massive issue of the financial damages. Arthur formally submitted my exhaustive $25,000 itemized contractor estimate into official court evidence. Michael's cheap lawyer immediately jumped up from his chair and frantically objected, wildly claiming the financial numbers were grossly inflated, entirely unreasonable, and clearly designed simply to maliciously punish his innocent client. Arthur calmly countered this desperate objection by handing the judge a thick stack of printed papers. It contained 3 completely independent, highly certified quotes from other major, licensed general contracting firms operating within the city. Their independent estimates were actually several $1,000s higher than the $25,000 I had calculated. My client is a fully licensed, highly experienced professional structural engineer and commercial contractor, Your Honor, Arthur explained incredibly patiently. The specific materials destroyed by the defendant were custom, incredibly high-end architectural fixtures. The plaintiff is solely seeking the exact replacement value of the raw materials and the standard, prevailing hourly labor rates required to restore the damaged property to its original, pristine condition. Michael sank lower into his wooden chair, the blood slowly draining from his face as the sheer financial reality of the situation finally began to pierce through his thick armor of entitlement. Finally, Arthur clicked a single button on his laptop keyboard. The defense claims that the massive, catastrophic damage to the property was a simple, unavoidable accident caused by the stress of moving, Arthur stated, turning to look directly at Michael. We formally submit this video evidence, legally and willingly obtained from the defendant's former spouse, establishing a highly documented, legally undeniable pattern of intentional, malicious property destruction whenever the defendant is operating under alleged emotional distress. Arthur pressed play. The high-definition security video played smoothly on the massive courtroom screen in crisp, undeniable 4K resolution. The entire courtroom watched in absolute, stunned silence as the footage vividly captured Michael screaming at the absolute top of his lungs like a deranged lunatic. It showed him violently taking a heavy metal golf club and repeatedly, viciously smashing a beautiful custom kitchen cabinet door until it was completely reduced to jagged splinters. The video then clearly showed him picking up a heavy, expensive crystal vase and hurling it with maximum force straight through a priceless, vintage stained glass window in the grand foyer. Michael's face drained of absolutely all remaining color. He looked like he was about to physically vomit. He sank down so low in his chair he practically disappeared, staring blankly at the scarred wooden table. My mother instantly stopped her fake, theatrical crying. The wadded-up tissue fell from her hands. She stared at the bright projection screen in open-mouthed, genuine horror. My father buried his face deeply into his calloused hands, shaking his head slowly. The lifelong, carefully crafted, deeply toxic illusion of their innocent, flawless golden child was being broadcast in high definition for the official, permanent legal record. The stern judge did not even need to call a brief recess to deliberate privately in her chambers. She simply looked over the top of her reading glasses down at Michael with an expression of absolute, unvarnished disgust. The overwhelming evidence presented in this courtroom today is absolutely undeniable, she stated firmly, her voice echoing with immense legal authority. This was not a simple family misunderstanding. This was an egregious, highly calculated violation of basic property rights, and the intentional, malicious, and frankly violent destruction of a private residence. She paused, making sure her next words landed with maximum impact. I am ruling completely and entirely in favor of the plaintiff for the full requested amount of exactly $25,000, plus all associated legal fees, attorney costs, and court filing fees. If the defendant fails to provide full payment within 30 days, the court will authorize immediate and indefinite wage garnishment. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel and struck the sound block with immense force. It sounded exactly like a loud gunshot. The execution was completely finished, and there was absolutely no appealing the cold, hard truth. The incredibly wide marble hallway immediately outside the courtroom was deeply quiet, save for the muffled, distant sounds of other minor legal proceedings taking place far down the corridor. Arthur shook my hand firmly, packed his encrypted laptop and heavy files back into his leather briefcase, and headed toward the bank of elevators, congratulating me on an absolutely flawless, undeniable legal victory. I stayed behind for a moment, standing completely alone near the tall, arched windows, silently watching the busy, chaotic city traffic moving through the streets far below. I felt incredibly light. The massive, suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders since childhood had finally been lifted. A moment later, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open violently, hitting the wall with a loud thud, and my former family walked out into the cold hall. The crushing, undeniable reality of a massive legal judgment had finally, physically hit them. Michael had absolutely zero personal assets to his name. He had no savings account. He had no job. The judge's official order was absolute and terrifying. If he did not pay the massive sum in full, his wages would be severely and legally garnished indefinitely the very moment he ever managed to find employment, and his personal credit score would be entirely destroyed for the rest of his adult life. My parents knew exactly what this meant. They knew perfectly well that saving their precious, perfect boy from total financial ruin and bankruptcy was going to require them to drastically liquidate a significant, painful portion of their own carefully guarded retirement accounts. My mother, Patricia, violently separated from the group and marched purposefully toward me, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble floor. Her eyes were still red from the courtroom, but there was absolutely no sadness or pathetic pleading in them anymore. There was only pure, unadulterated fury. My father and Michael hung back cowardly near the heavy doors, staring at the floor, far too pathetic to walk up and face me directly. "Are you finally happy now?" she hissed venomously, stopping just a few feet away from me, her face contorted in anger. Her hands were balled into tight, shaking fists. "You just completely ruined your own brother's entire life. You practically stole directly from your own parents. We are going to have to dip deeply into our retirement savings to pay for this ridiculous, entirely vindictive judgment. You actively destroyed this entire family over a stupid, meaningless apartment." I looked down at her, calmly studying her furious face. I realized in that exact, crystallizing moment that I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel betrayed. I just felt a profound, echoing sense of emptiness, like I was looking at a complete, deranged stranger whose personal, chaotic problems were absolutely none of my concern. "I did not destroy anything," I replied, my voice remaining dangerously calm, cold, and completely level. "Michael broke the law. You actively enabled his horrific behavior and cheered him on. The judge simply held him legally accountable for his own violent actions. That is exactly how the real world operates outside of your toxic living room." "He is your younger brother," she cried out, her shrill voice echoing loudly down the long marble hallway. "Family is supposed to love each other unconditionally. Family forgives terrible mistakes. Family is supposed to treat each other significantly better than strangers." I corrected her coldly, absolutely refusing to break eye contact. If a random, nameless stranger broke into my secure home, changed my electronic locks, and intentionally caused tens of thousands of dollars in property damage, I would have pushed the district attorney for maximum criminal felony charges. I would have made absolutely sure he was locked in a jail cell. I let Michael walk away today with a simple civil penalty. Taking his money instead of taking his freedom was my absolute final act of mercy to this so-called family. Do not ever attempt to contact me again. I turned my back on her before she could even open her mouth to formulate a toxic response. I walked away with steady, incredibly purposeful strides toward the elevators. As I walked, I pulled my cell phone out of my jacket pocket, went deep into my contacts, and permanently blocked her number, my father's number, and Michael's number. The polished metal elevator doors opened with a soft, pleasing chime. I stepped casually inside, pressed the glowing button for the main lobby, and watched my mother's deeply shocked, pale face disappear forever behind the closing metal doors. 6 full months had peacefully passed since the sound of that heavy gavel echoing in the courtroom. The slow transition from a bitter, freezing winter into a vibrant, warm early spring had finally breathed new life into the bustling city. The massive sum of $25,000 had cleared into my business bank account exactly 30 days after the stern judge issued the court ruling. I knew for an absolute fact, through the inevitable family grapevine, that my parents had been legally forced to drain a massive, painful chunk of their retirement funds to pay the penalty on Michael's behalf. But I honestly did not lose a single second of sleep over it. I took that money and utilized the funds exactly as they were legally intended. I occasionally heard minor, pathetic updates through distant relatives who still desperately tried to stalk my social media. Apparently, Michael was still miserably sleeping on my parents' lumpy, uncomfortable couch. He was currently bouncing rapidly and aggressively between terrible minimum wage jobs, constantly getting fired, and constantly blaming the entire world, his ex-wife and me for his massive, undeniable failures. My parents were supposedly still complaining bitterly to absolutely anyone who would tolerate listening about their cruel, ungrateful, cold-hearted eldest son who abandoned them. They were entirely trapped in a miserable, toxic echo chamber of their own making. But all of that chaotic noise just felt like a terrible, low-budget movie playing in a completely different room with the volume turned all the way down to zero. It did not touch me, could not reach me anymore. The evening weather was absolutely perfect. I stood out on the private, open-air rooftop terrace of my apartment building, using a pair of metal tongs to carefully flip a thick, perfectly marbled ribeye steak on my massive stainless steel grill. The evening air smelled incredibly good, a rich mixture of wood smoke, charred meat, and the faint, cool, salty breeze blowing in constantly from the city harbor. Directly behind me, the heavy sliding glass doors leading into my loft were pushed wide open to let the fresh air circulate. Inside, the apartment was absolutely pristine. In fact, it was significantly better than pristine. I had hired a highly specialized, incredibly expensive crew to come in and polish my custom concrete kitchen island back to a flawless, mirror-like finish. The ruined Brazilian walnut floors were entirely ripped out and replaced, meticulously sanded and perfectly sealed, gleaming richly in the warm afternoon sunlight. I also took the opportunity to make a few serious military-grade security upgrades. The standard smart lock on the heavy steel front door was now entirely gone, replaced by a commercial enterprise-grade biometric fingerprint scanner wired with encrypted software. The master code could absolutely never be bypassed with a physical emergency key ever again. My personal fortress was now absolute and impenetrable. "Those steaks are looking really good, man," Arthur said, stepping out onto the terrace and pulling me out of my thoughts. My lawyer had become a good friend over the past 6 months. He handed me a cold, sweating bottle of imported beer. "Give them exactly 5 more minutes to rest," I told him, taking a long, refreshing sip of the cold beer. Looking back inside the brightly lit loft, 3 of my best colleagues from the commercial construction firm were sitting around my large dining table, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just told. It was a relatively small gathering, just a few solid, reliable guys who actually understood the true value of hard work, deep respect, and unbreakable loyalty. "You ever hear anything from them?" Arthur asked quietly, leaning his elbows against the brick parapet and looking out thoughtfully at the glowing city skyline. He did not need to specify who the word "them" meant. "No," I said simply, keeping my eyes focused firmly on the hot grill. "And I never will. The boundary is permanently set in stone. This space was completely and utterly mine. I had bought it with my own intense labor, designed it with my own intellect, and violently defended it with cold, hard, undeniable facts. Sharing blood with someone does not ever entitle them to drain your sanity. Sharing DNA is absolutely not a blank check to freely destroy what you have painstakingly built. Some life lessons are incredibly expensive to teach, and some bridges absolutely need to be burned completely to the ground so that the fire can light your way forward in the dark." I pulled the perfectly cooked steaks off the hot grill, setting them carefully on a thick wooden cutting board to rest. I breathed in the cool evening air deeply, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of true peace. I was a builder. I had found the deep rot spreading in the foundation, and I had surgically removed it. Now, there was absolutely nothing left to do but peacefully enjoy the strong, beautiful house I had built. Before we go, tell me in the comments, have you ever had to legally sever ties with your own blood? Share your survival story down below. And if you enjoyed this story of absolute justice, please hit that like button, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching.